Good morning. My name is Kerry Lay. I'm your board treasurer, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Brunswick on this Wabanaki land we now call Brunswick, Maine. If you are visiting and would like more information about our congregation, please stop at the visitors table in the fellowship hall. The folks there will be happy to answer any of your questions. In the interest of safety, please note that there are 3 exits to this building. One is through the door you came in by, directly behind you. A second exit is at the back of this room, on that side, just past the AV booth. And a third is at the far back, also on that far, what is your right side, at the back past RE. As we begin service today, please silence your mobile phones or other devices. Once again, welcome. We're glad you're here.
Good morning. I'd like to say something about our speaker today, Ann Spencer, whom I met here in this congregation in the 1980s, and I'm very pleased to be working with her today. Ann lives here in the warm weather months and has been living in Colorado with her mom during the cold weather months. And while she was here as a member for the last 40 years plus, she held several leadership positions in the congregation, and her most favorite thing that she wanted to say was that she loved singing in the choir and also, oh dear, there it goes. Helping out with Concerts for a Cause. So I wanted to let you know who is speaking today. My name is Lucy. I'm a member of the worship committee, and our opening words are by Susan McGinn, Call from Beyond. From beyond the playful summer clouds, beyond the earth's thin blue line, from beyond the bright moon and meteor showers, we hear the call to look and listen carefully, to turn away from a world that buys and sells happiness, to fully experience the luring whisper of your heart's truth. Why not today? Why not now? We are here and together at home in this evolving place, home in this ever-changing breath and body, home in this dewy morning, even as it reaches toward a hot, high noon. We hear the call from far beyond and deep within, and we do not hear it alone. Come, let us worship together. The opening hymn is number 41, You That Have Spent the Silent Night, and please rise in body or spirit when you feel so moved.
Announcing. Samantha Nord has our joys and concerns this morning.
Good morning. So for today, for joys, we have just one, the beautiful art displayed in the foyer. I would agree. For concerns, healing thoughts to Catherine Clark, who suffered a fractured elbow in a recent fall. That is all we have for today. So if you are not attending in-person services and would like a joy or concern read from the pulpit, you may send an email to uucbjoysandconcerns@gmail.com. The address should be up on the screen and in UUCB's weekly email. If you have a concern you would like to discuss in private, please speak with a pastoral care associate. We have little blue ribbons on our name tags and would be happy to help and listen. Thank you.
Our responsive reading this morning is number 515 in the gray hymnal. Should be on your screen as well. I will lead it off, and Lucy will lead you in responding. This is called We Lift Up Our Hearts in Thanks by Richard Fuchs. For the sun and the dawn which we did not create,
For the moon and the evening which we did not make,
for food which we plant but cannot grow,
for friends and loved ones we have not earned and cannot buy,
for this gathered company which welcomes us as we are, from wherever we have come,
for all our free churches that keep us human and encourage us in our quest for beauty, truth, and love,
for all things which come to us as gifts of being from sources beyond ourselves,
gifts of life and love and friendship, we lift up our hearts in thanks this day.
Well, good morning. Nice to see old and new faces. I chose the song by George Harrison. It's one of my favorites. And then I reprinted the words, or had the words as our centering thought. I like that verse in particular because it reminds us that just as darkness or stormy weather inevitably pass into daytime or sunny skies, so too do difficult times in our own lives and in the lives of our church communities. The darkness may be something that was building for a long time, or like a squall, comes on suddenly. The storm can pass into daytime just as slowly, or suddenly we find it is sunny again. This morning, I'm sharing with you how the UU churches I have known influenced some of my own stormy times and how I experienced some of their challenges as well. You can find evidence of the UU principles at work within these stories. If you're not familiar with the principles, you can find them in the pages just before the hymn in the gray hymnal. I find it useful to read them occasionally, remind myself what they are. Well, as long as I've been a member here, I've been visiting my mother in Colorado Springs. After so long living in forested Maine, Colorado Springs is a foreign-looking place in many ways. The trees grow naturally only along creek beds. And although there are two very major rivers, 50 miles in either direction of Colorado Springs, the Platte, which kind of runs near Denver, and the Arkansas. Colorado Springs doesn't sit on a river, it sits on a creek. The dry climate there makes the landscape brown and dusty most of the year. But just as the Maine coast sits on the edge where land meets water, Colorado Springs sits on the edge where the highest point on the vast prairies runs smack into the easternmost mountain of the Front Range of the Rockies. Oddly enough, from that highest point on the plains, which is about 30 miles to the east, the city of 500,000 that spreads over more than 200 square miles isn't even visible at the base of Pikes Peak because the city sits in a little bit of a valley. It was the view eastward from the top of Pikes Peak that inspired America the Beautiful, when the city was still in transition from a wild gold rush town to becoming a civilized city. Early on, the clean, dry air, the year-round sunny climate made it an ideal place for TB sanitariums. The remnants of several of them are around the city repurposed. The railroad was extended south from Denver. Those who came and stayed soon brought their Eastern U.S. religions with them. Evidence is in the skyline of the downtown, not much bigger than Portland's, which has several mainline churches whose architecture seems to have a little bit more of a New England flavor than Western. And they, like the churches here, are located on prominent corners. All Souls Unitarian Universalist among them, which was built in 1893. Another similarity between the two locations is the variability in the weather. The mountain interface can deflect snowstorms or winds that arrive from any direction. And just as the weather a few miles in to inland Maine can differ widely from ours on the coast, there can be a storm on the eastern side of the city, while snug against the mountains the sun can be shining, or vice versa. The saying there is, not only do we have 4 seasons here, but we can have weather from any season at any time during any other. UU churches have been welcome havens in foreign places and important passages in my life. The first time as a teenager in Dallas, following my parents' divorce, it became my mother's new church home when the Episcopal church we'd attended regularly as a family simply became too uncomfortable. And although as a child I had loved its rituals of prescribed prayers, rich music played on a grand pipe organ, and magical stained glass windows, suddenly none of that seemed to matter or mean much to me anymore. At that juncture, it would have been easy to give up on church altogether, but Mom seemed satisfied with her new church. And when I tagged along during the rest of high school and occasional weekends home from college, it seemed to work for me too. During her stint as church president, the church organized a social action fair. Outsiders proclaimed the announced participating organizations were subversive, and they demanded that the fair be shut down. Well, several lawyers in the congregation joined forces to defend the church's right to hold the fair. It ultimately prevailed, and the fair took place. After college, I left Texas and church going behind for a few years of self-discovery, ending up in San Diego with my spouse, a newly minted Navy officer. There, we both wanted an alternative to total immersion in Navy life, which would have been possible, social occasions, et cetera, et cetera. The UU church was in our neighborhood. We started attending and were enriched by our involvement there. I don't recall any dark clouds for that congregation, but joining the finance committee gave me an understanding that responsible administration was every bit as important to a church's success as effective ministers and a strong volunteer network. Meanwhile, my dad and step-family, who had attended the same Episcopal church in Dallas, became UUs in Houston. When I traveled there for his memorial service from California, the UU version of that ritual felt familiar and gave consolation. Well, after 4 years in San Diego, it was a given that we'd attend this church when the Navy transferred us here. The church was in the capable hands of a temporary minister during Minister Will Saunders' short sabbatical. The old 1880s building had a dirt floor basement, mostly occupied by the heating oil tank and a small kitchen. It was being renovated by the volunteers for electric heat and a more welcoming place for conversation, coffee, and holiday fundraising fish chowder luncheons. That was a promising sign. There was no administrative staff. Photocopying was done 1 coin at a time at the Bowdoin College Library. Will's departure a few years later prompted us to hire an administrator, part-time, and purchase office equipment as we entered a 2-year interim period to search for our next minister. With a search committee in place, guided by the prescribed UUA process, a steady religious education program, and competent office support, we thought we could conserve finances by not hiring an interim for the 2 years. Surely we could get along organizing our own Sunday services, and we did. There must have been some bumpy times and some financial uncertainties, but mostly I think of that as a time when we discovered our strength as a congregation, and we enthusiastically called Brad Mitchell as our minister for the fall of 1987. During Brad's 18-year ministry, the most contentious issue was a growing dissatisfaction with our building. It was in the same location, but the entrance was on Pleasant Street with a grand set of stairs up to the main door. It had 3 levels, but only the first floor was really easily accessible. The basement flooded in heavy rain. Frequent attempts to remedy that didn't cure the problem. Some felt the site and the neighborhood parking limited our ability to expand. Others felt that the Victorian-era sanctuary itself was so church-like that it was an uncomfortable reminder for people who had negative associations with traditional churches. We were able to improve the situation by buying the adjacent duplex on Middle Street for our offices and RE program. We built a ramp for the front door, and we perked up the interior with fresh paint. And I believe we replaced the carpeting at one point. But none of that changed the basic objections of some, and it was awkward, especially in winter, to have the children and office in a separate building. It simply didn't work to have the two. Our site restrictions just continued to nag at us. This gray sky and malaise hung over us for years, until a newcomer to the congregation, kind of on his own, found what seemed to be a suitable new location on a wooded lot south of Cook's Corner. With his offer of a substantial contribution, we voted to purchase it as a possible future location, and we raised the necessary funds. After Brad completed his ministry with us in 2005, we had 2 different interim ministers, while our elected search committee again went about its UUA prescribed process, keeping us informed along the way of what stage we were at and what we could expect going forward. We called Sylvia Stalker as our minister in 2007. Meanwhile, we sat with those same continuing gray clouds of indecision about the second property while we explored alternatives. Might we remodel our in-town buildings or replace them? Or did we really want to build a new structure and parking lot on the site tucked away in the woods? Well, the singular most challenging event during Sylvia's era was the church fire in June 2011, which finally forced us to resolve the property question. We met over at the library for a while. We then started meeting at there is a synagogue in Bath, and they graciously offered us their Hebrew school, which was separate from their sanctuary building. Turned out that was on the site of a long-gone Universalist church. And for 3 years, we had a very capable building committee that carried the load on working with architects and bringing things to a vote at appropriate moments. And ultimately, we voted to raise both our badly damaged building, church building, and the intact but equally inadequate office building. We sold the other site to the local land trust and built the larger, 1-story, no basement, flexible purpose structure we enjoy today here. Fortunately, we were able to save the piano, the Longfellow Bible that sits back in that corner, install the Revere bell, and a few of the stained glass windows. These 2, the little one in the wall between when you come in, and there's a replica of a stained glass window in the small room. I forget the name of it, but the small room there. The 2 pews along the side walls, these 2 large chairs in the chancel were saved, but the lectern here, the bench that sits behind us, some of you may never have really seen it well, and the chalice tables are made from repurposed wood from both buildings, thanks to Mike Heath, who's sitting in the booth this morning. These objects that we brought forward help us honor our history and our sustainability. Well, Sylvia retired in 2020, and by then we were in the early stages of COVID. Our farewell to her took the form of a parade past her home, where we waved to each other from a safe distance. The board chose Justine Sullivan as our interim. She and we alike rose to the challenge of worshiping and holding essential meetings by Zoom. The choir even tried to practice and perform that way. I took a little time out. I wasn't quite up for that. Once again, we had an elected search committee, hard at work in the background, who brought us Reverend Karma Amos last fall, just as I headed to Colorado Springs for a long visit again. So now a little bit more about Colorado Springs. I'm painting a picture here. By the time the tuberculosis epidemic subsided, and with the advent of the automobile, the tourism industry was spawned, capitalizing on nearby mineral waters and gateways into the mountains and points west. World War II and the Cold War brought a large Army base, the Air Force Academy, and a top-secret Air Defense Command buried in a mountain. Conservative organizations such as Focus on the Family and Olympic-related things, their sports offices, their training center, and now a beautiful museum located there too. It's pretty easy to sense an aura, kind of an aura of military and fundamentalist values dominating the region. But the liberal elements, small though they are strong in their own right. And people carry out their values conflicts in school and library boards, as well as city and state politics. In this setting, All Souls UU has endured for 130 years. Its website highlights its history this way, quoting, "Since its inception, All Souls has proudly carried on the tradition of social justice activism, with members of the church helping to found several local nonprofits over the years. All Souls provided a place for activists who were organizing against the repressive Amendment 2, which sought, this was a statewide ballot issue, which sought to limit gay rights. It passed, but ultimately was overturned by the Supreme Court. In the mid-'70s, every theater in town refused to show the movie The Last Temptation of Christ, but we showed the film twice a night for a week to standing room only in the face of nightly protesters and a bomb threat. Currently, we are working with a coalition to provide not only hospitality, but advocacy for immigrant rights. Well, during my many visits to Colorado Springs, I've often attended a Sunday service at All Souls. But without learning much about its inner workings, budget, and so on, I was already doing that here. I really just wanted to visit. In my recent stays, I took that same stance, and I also started visiting the newer UU congregation called High Plains and learned this about its history. It was seeded 30 years ago by All Souls. Not a division, not a rift, but with their blessing and seed money, when attendance soared during this statewide amendment gay rights conflict. High Plains was described as a rare bastion of progressive hope, and in its heyday, it grew large enough to buy a building, but 5 years ago, they sold the building to share up finances that had become shaky, renting space for afternoon services at another church building closer to downtown. Well, as of last fall, both churches were without settled ministers. All Souls had a 2-year interim minister and student intern. High Plains part-time minister had taken a medical retirement and was sorely missed. All Souls seemed to be thriving and eagerly anticipating the outcome of its search process, but it became clear to me as a newcomer that High Plains was struggling. Despite an official count of 60 members, only a handful were keeping things running, and some of them had been doing that since the church was founded. Some of them were pretty tired. It had been without a full complement of board members for the past several years, and they only required 5. 3 people had been on the board. Sunday attendance was sporadic at both its worship services and monthly social justice forums. Just the same, I gravitated toward that congregation, and I joined a Chalice Circle small discussion group to deepen my connection. Last November, The type of darkness, just like our fire, that descends in an instant, happened. Across town, a disgruntled patron carried a gun. On a Saturday night, into an LGBTQ nightclub called Club Q. He killed 5 people, and he left many more injured and traumatized. Well, the next morning, the student minister was on duty. The other was in another pulpit. At All Souls. She preached a compassionate sermon to a full house of shocked, angry, and grieving people from both congregations. Word had been passed to the wider community that there would be a public gathering following that morning service. We were shooed out, and it took 2 separate sessions that overflowed the sanctuary to accommodate everyone who came, whether they had been impacted directly or were standing in solidarity with the victims. Well, in the spring, while the search at All Souls was zeroing in on a candidate, the boards of both churches began meeting to consider formalizing some kind of collaboration that would benefit both, but mainly help to shore up High Plains, possibly merging the two. We were kept generally apprised of their progress, but not the details. I joined the church at this juncture, wanting to lend my support and have a vote, whatever the outcome. High Plains hired 2 professionals for guidance, an attorney who specialized in nonprofit corporations, and a consulting minister to tend to the congregation. It didn't take long after the merger discussions failed to determine that the church could no longer surmount the obstacles of declining membership, inadequate financial support, and volunteer burnout. Despite its good programming on Sundays that attracted a regular but small group. It also felt that absent increased support from members, although the church had a healthy endowment, the board felt it would simply squander that to just try to administer an official church that really didn't have the horsepower to keep going. The board believed that High Plains could best continue to live out its commitment to spiritual growth and social justice by dissolving as a congregation and donating its assets to the area nonprofits that the church had supported over the years with funds and volunteer efforts. The endowment would be given to All Souls, partly to repay the initial seed money, but mainly to assure a strong UU presence in the city into the future. Of course, some folks protested. Couldn't believe this was the only option. Meetings were held to explain the dissolution process and the recommendation for the distribution of the funds. The minister held sessions for us to express our disbelief, grief, or relief. A consensus evolved to support this course of action, such that when the formal meeting was held in early May, with more people there than typically on a Sunday morning, the decision was all but unanimous to dissolve by June 30. 10 nonprofits would share the $100,000 in remaining operating funds. The remainder, High Plains Endowment Fund, was going to All Souls to repay the seed money many times over. High Plains held its final service in mid-June. Earlier that week, the daily newspaper's front page headline declared, and I was shocked, Progressive Church to close in a $450,000 blaze of glory. The dissolution was further described as not a failure, but a brave choice. The minister did a masterful job weaving together grief for the end of a beloved community alongside a celebration of its accomplishments. Past leaders reminisced about the persistence that had helped the congregation weather its rough patches. The nonprofit recipients were there to gratefully receive their contributions and honor High Plains' support. Now, I don't know how the endowment grew to be $350,000, but that was the fact. The minister proclaimed that while High Plains was ending, congregations are not the measure of our success or the depth of our beliefs and our actions in the world, and compared High Plains to a flower that does not live forever but creates seeds of ongoing life. And All Souls' new minister, not yet arrived in Colorado Springs, by Zoom welcomed everyone from High Plains who might either return to to All Souls, or seek a new church home there. Indeed, of all the passages I've described today, this was the most powerful. It's time for the morning offering.
Our custom is to take what is in the offering plate that is cash and not related to a pledge offering, and share it with a local charity with soul. This month's charity is the Habitat for Humanity, Seven Rivers Habitat for Humanity, which does wonderful work. And this congregation has supported very well. Please join me in the response to our offering. May these offerings sustain and grow the work of this church, weaving a tapestry of love and action.
I just want to say a word about the piece that Nell played. It's a melody by Duke Ellington that I'm fond of. I asked her to tackle that one. It was occasioned after the Duke Ellington Orchestra toured England and performed for the Queen. And this was at a time when the band traveled in its own railroad cars because they were not allowed to eat in the places that they performed. So they were more comfortable alone in keeping to themselves in their own train cars. They had such wonderful hospitality in England, in contrast, that when they got back to America, Duke Ellington wrote this tune to thank them. Oh, I'm sorry, and it was called The Single Petal of a Rose.
Our closing hymn is number 128, For All That Is Our Life. You may rise in body or in spirit. You may be seated. The closing words are Between the Dawn and the Dusk by Carl Seberg. Between the dawn and the dusk of our being, let us be brave and loving. In our little passage through the light, let us sustain and forward the human venture in gentleness, in service, and in thought. Amen. Greet your neighbors.